Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today we're going to dig into a really foundational argument from Jonathan Edwards. He gets right to the heart of the Christian faith and asks, why was the cross even necessary? And he builds this amazing case, just piece by logical piece, starting with God's law and ending up at the sacrifice of Christ.
So, Edwards saw this major puzzle in theology, something he called a Gordian knot. It's this real tension between two ideas we hold. On one hand, forgiveness is a totally free gift from God, right? But on the other, redemption was bought with a price, an incredible price. So he's asking, wait a minute, if a debt was paid, how can we honestly say the pardon is free? And that's really the question at the center of this whole thing, isn't it? How can forgiveness be a free gift if it has been paid for? This is the puzzle Edwards set out to solve. And believe it or not, his answer starts with who God is and the nature of his law.
Okay, so to untie that knot, we've got to start right where Edwards did, with divine law. See, for Edwards, God's rule over all creation, what he calls his moral government, it's not just random. It flows directly from his own goodness. And you think about it, any government that's going to be a real government has to have laws.
And here is the logical chain he lays out for us. It's pretty straightforward. God's moral government requires laws. Okay, but a law that doesn't have a penalty, well, it's not really a law, is it? It's more like a suggestion. And for that law to have any actual authority, that penalty has to be enforced. If it's not, the law just becomes meaningless. And Edwards is pretty blunt here. If God declares a penalty for sin but then just doesn't follow through, it makes both his law and himself seem weak or dishonorable and contemptible. It would suggest he either made a bad law in the first place, couldn't enforce it, or just wasn't serious. An unenforced law doesn't stop sin. It actually encourages it.
All right, so the law demands a penalty. That brings us to the next logical question. Can we pay it ourselves? Can a person somehow atone for their own sin and just, settle the account with God?
Well, according to Edwards, the answer is a hard no, for a couple of big reasons. First, just being sorry and repenting is what he calls a mere return to our duty. It's just getting back to what you were supposed to be doing all along. It doesn't actually do anything about the crime you already committed. And second, accepting some kind of lesser punishment doesn't work either, because if a smaller penalty would have been enough, it makes God's original threat seem unjust, cruel, and oppressive.
Edwards uses this great analogy of a deserting soldier. Imagine a soldier abandons his post, goes and joins the enemy, and then later feels bad about it and comes back. Does his repentance and reformation just erase the treason? Of course not. The crime was committed and justice has to be served to uphold the law. It's the same logic he argues with our sin against God.
So let's recap. If the law absolutely demands a penalty, and we've established that we are completely unable to pay that penalty ourselves, the argument really only leads to one place. A substitute is necessary. Somebody else has to step in and satisfy the law's demands on our behalf. And this gets us to a really precise definition of what atonement actually is. It isn't just any old action. It has to be something that achieves the very same purpose as punishing the sinner would have. It has to be a full equivalent, a payment that upholds the authority of God's law and shows everyone just how serious sin truly is.
And this is exactly where Christ's work on the cross becomes so central. His sacrifice is the substitute penalty. And because of who he is, the Son of God, with infinite dignity and glory, his suffering had enough value to be a sufficient equivalent that could satisfy the law's demands. And the proof that this was the only way? Just look at his prayer in Gethsemane. If there had been any other way, the Father would have let that cup pass from him. It was absolutely necessary.
So now we can circle all the way back to that first problem we talked about, that Gordian knot Edwards mentioned. Now that we have this whole framework in place, we can finally see how God's free grace and the price paid for redemption fit together perfectly. First off, the atonement totally satisfies the demands of God's justice. The penalty for sin was paid in full by a worthy substitute. So the law was honored, and God's character as a just and righteous ruler was put on full display. Justice was served. But here's the beautiful answer to the puzzle. Yes, a price was paid, but we didn't pay it. God himself, out of his own incredible grace, provided the substitute. So the gift of grace isn't that God just ignores the debt, it's that God pays the debt for us. So at the cross, we see these two sides of God's character come together. He remains perfectly just because sin is punished,
And at the same time, he is the one who justifies sinners because he's the one who provided the sacrifice. Both of those truths can stand together without any contradiction at all. And seeing that helps us grasp how God can be perfectly holy and perfectly merciful at the very same time.
And this leaves us with something to think about. Edward's whole argument really makes you consider the relationship between justice and grace. So here's the question. If God's perfect justice required such an unbelievably costly foundation, what does that really tell us about the nature of the divine grace that provided it?